My son-in-law faked a financial crisis to drain my granddaughter's trust. I let him eat his favorite meal before I ruined him. Whoa there, chubby, Greg said, grinning around the dining room table like he had rehearsed the line in the rearview mirror on the drive over. You really don't need those empty calories. I'm just looking out for your heart. He said it loudly. He wanted witnesses. It was the third Sunday of the month, the one where I always made the herb-crusted pork loin and the apple crisp because it was my husband Arthur's favorite. Sunday dinner at my table had been a fixed point in this family's week for 12 years, much longer than Greg had even been a part of it. The good china was out. The linen napkins were folded. My 6-year-old granddaughter Sophie had her booster seat pushed in tight against the table between her mother and me. The window behind Arthur's chair was fogged from the oven heat, and somewhere under the table, Sophie's dog-eared coloring book sat forgotten next to her light-up sneakers. The room went dead silent. Sophie's small silver fork clattered against her porcelain plate. My husband Arthur froze mid-chew beside me. A piece of pork loin was still speared on the end of his fork. And my daughter Claire, 30 years old, a grown woman with a mortgage, a 6-year-old child, and a master's degree in data analytics she never got to use, turned a deep, humiliated shade of crimson. She folded into herself like she was trying to physically disappear into the upholstery of her own dining chair. Greg looked around the table, his eyes bright and expectant, waiting for someone to laugh with him. He always waited for that. That was the fundamental truth about Greg. He needed an audience for a joke to land. Otherwise, it wasn't a joke at all. It was just cruelty standing entirely alone in a room with nowhere to hide. Nobody laughed. Sophie looked from her mother's empty spot on the placemat to her own small dessert bowl and asked, in a very quiet, hesitant voice, "Is mommy on a diet again?" "She's always on one, sweetie," Greg said, reaching over to aggressively ruffle Sophie's hair like this was all still a charming family sitcom. "Mommy just forgets her goals sometimes. That's what I'm here for. I keep us on track." Claire didn't say a single word. She stared down at the cream tablecloth, fixing her eyes on a tiny candle wax burn near her right elbow from 3 Christmases ago. I watched her hands go completely still, folded tightly in her lap, the exact way they always went still now, careful. Braced for impact. I had been watching my brilliant, vibrant daughter go perfectly still like that for 7 long years. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate. I didn't say anything yet. I spent 35 years working as an emergency room trauma nurse. And if there is one thing 35 years in a chaotic hospital teaches you, it is a very specific, surgical kind of patience. The kind of patience that waits for exactly the right millisecond to act, because acting too early, before the bleeding is fully exposed, can cost you the entire procedure. Greg didn't know it, sitting there with warm cinnamon apple filling on his thumb, and a smug smile still tugging at the corner of his mouth, but he had just told his absolute last joke inside my house. He had no earthly idea what was already sitting just 6 feet away from his elbow, zipped securely into the inside leather pocket of my daughter's tote bag. It was the bag where she had been keeping the things she absolutely didn't want anyone to find by accident. She had been carrying it everywhere for 6 weeks. He just didn't know it yet. My name is Martha. I am 61 years old. I spent my entire career at Crestwood General, the only major hospital in our Pennsylvania town, the same town where I raised my daughter and where, 30 years ago, I sat in the maternity ward holding Claire for the very first time. My husband Arthur is 64. He was a structural engineer who designed half the commercial bridges in this county before he retired, and he has never in his entire life used more words than a sentence strictly required. When Arthur speaks, people stop and listen, because it means he has decided the moment is actually worth the effort of his breath. We have been married for 40 years, and in all that time, I do not believe he has ever once looked at my dinner plate, my credit card balance, or my text messages to monitor me. It is a profoundly strange and agonizing thing to watch your daughter's marriage slowly suffocate from inside the safety of a good one. You keep expecting the sharp discomfort you feel to eventually resolve itself into something you recognize, some familiar, harmless shape of ordinary marital friction. But instead, it just keeps sitting there in the room with you, deeply wrong, completely refusing to become anything you have the language to excuse. Claire was always the exceptionally bright one. She was the valedictorian at Crestwood High, got a statistics degree from Penn State, and then a master's in data analytics 2 years after that. Her education was paid for in part by a generous trust my own aunt, Beatrice, had left behind for exactly that purpose. By the time she was 23, Claire was working as a senior data analyst at Crestwood Community Credit Union, the exact same branch on Route 4 where she had opened her very first savings account at age 8 with $50 in birthday money. She was incredibly good at her job. She had a ruthless eye for numbers that didn't quite add up, and a bottomless patience for tracing a tiny financial discrepancy all the way back to its hidden source. Her branch manager once told me she had the best forensic audit instincts he had seen in 2 decades of hiring. She met Greg Vance at a mutual friend's wedding in Philadelphia the summer she turned 23. He was 26, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, incredibly quick with a flattering compliment, and exactly the kind of man who tipped generously in front of a large group of people only to complain bitterly about the service the second they were out of earshot. He worked as a luxury real estate agent, and he talked endlessly that first night about a commercial brokerage firm he was planning to open next fall. A fall that, 7 years later, still hadn't ever materialized. I clearly remember the first time I met him. It was a Sunday dinner, at the exact same mahogany table where he would humiliate her 7 years later. He shook Arthur's hand way too hard, trying to assert dominance, and asked me within 20 minutes of arriving what our property was currently appraised for and whether we had paid off the mortgage yet. "Just curious," he said, flashing a bright, empty smile. "I'm a numbers guy. I just can't help it." Occupational hazard. He aggressively complimented my pork loin, then told me completely unprompted that his own mother couldn't cook to save her life. It was a casual, throwing under the bus comment that made Arthur's jaw tighten in a specific way I would learn years later meant something deeply profound. I told myself it was just youthful confidence. I told myself a lot of stupid things back then. There was a night, 8 months into their dating, when Claire brought him to my brother's retirement party at the local country club. Claire had just been offered a massive promotion at the credit union, her first major supervisory role overseeing the entire analytics department, and she was absolutely glowing about it all evening, telling anyone who would listen. Greg waited until they were driving home alone in the dark to tell her that a stressful promotion might not be the smartest move right now, timing-wise, if they were thinking long-term about starting a family. She was 24. They weren't even engaged yet. She turned the promotion down 2 weeks later and told her devastated supervisor she wanted to focus on other personal priorities. I remember being shocked at the time, but I didn't ask enough questions about why. Arthur noticed the subtle, insidious things before I did, in his own quiet, observant way. He mentioned once, very early on, that Greg never let a natural silence sit at the dinner table for more than 5 seconds without filling it with his own voice, the way some men simply cannot stand not being the one holding the microphone. "That man doesn't like being unwatched," Arthur said quietly while washing dishes one night. At the time, I took it for one of his odd little structural observations and nothing more. I think about that sentence almost every day now. They married 18 months later at the Crestwood Methodist Church. Claire wore my mother's vintage pearl earrings. At the reception, Greg gave a long, rambling toast about building a massive empire together that made half the banquet room laugh politely, and the other half, in horrible hindsight, should have made them immediately call a cab. Sophie was born 2 years after the wedding. That was precisely the time Claire quietly quit her job at the credit union. "Greg thinks it makes more financial sense for me to just be home," she told me over the phone one Tuesday morning, her voice pitched unnaturally bright and speaking just a little too fast. "We ran all the numbers. Daycare basically eats my entire paycheck anyway, Mom. It's just logic." I didn't push her. I told myself it was her marriage, her choice, her math to run. I have thought about that terrible phone call more times than I can ever count since. The pattern of his control, when I look back at it now, started small enough that it was sickeningly easy to excuse, one isolated incident at a time. 3 years ago at Thanksgiving, Greg pulled out his smartphone before Claire had taken 2 bites of her mashed potatoes and photographed her plate from above. "Accountability," he said, winking at the rest of the table like it was incredibly cute, like it was a shared, intimate joke between the two of them instead of a chokehold. "Somebody's got to keep this one honest." Claire forced a laugh. "He's just teasing," she said, her cheeks burning red, and she reached for her ice water glass instead of her fork. I remember watching my brilliant, highly capable daughter apologize with her entire body language for the simple act of having food in front of her. I remember thinking it was bizarre and uncomfortable. I did not yet understand that it was merely the first heavy stone in a massive brick wall he was building around her. By the following spring, the control shifted entirely to money. Her debit card was declined at Miller's Pharmacy in front of a bored teenage cashier, not just once, but twice in the same month. Both times were for amounts under $40. "Oh, Greg handles all the banking stuff now," she told me afterward in the parking lot, her voice painfully rehearsed, like she had practiced the exact cadence of the sentence in the mirror. A few weeks after that humiliating pharmacy trip, she asked her own father for $60 in physical cash for Sophie's preschool field trip to the zoo. "Please don't tell Greg," she whispered, hastily folding the $20 bills into her winter coat pocket before Arthur had even finished counting them out. "He really doesn't like surprises in the checking account." Then, it was her people. He systematically dismantled her support network. Her college roommate Jessica, who used to come over every single Thursday evening for wine and reality television, stopped coming completely because Greg made the living room unbearable. He would sit in the corner chair, sighing loudly, aggressively turning the TV volume down, or asking pointed, condescending questions about Jessica's dating life until she felt too awkward to ever return. Her weekly mothers group at the community center was gone within a year because Greg insisted the other women were a toxic influence on her spending habits. Her personal therapist, a wonderful woman named Dr. Aris, she had seen for 8 sessions to deal with postpartum anxiety, was abruptly cancelled because Greg demanded to know what Claire was saying about their marriage behind his back, claiming therapy was just making her dramatic and unstable. One by one, every single door out of that marriage got quietly, firmly closed and locked, and every single time, Claire explained it to me using his exact vocabulary instead of her own. I watched my tiny granddaughter start repeating his rigid rules like they were religious scripture. "Mommy's not allowed to have bread rolls," Sophie announced once at an Easter dinner, barely 5 years old, looking incredibly proud to know the household law. I watched Claire's face when she said it. I have dealt with a lot of grieving families in the ER, and I know exactly what it looks like when someone is trying very hard not to shatter into a million pieces in front of a room that is actively watching them. There was a version of my daughter once who did not constantly check anyone's face for permission before she spoke. I remember her at 17, standing in the kitchen of our old house, fiercely arguing with her high school guidance counselor over the phone about a computer scheduling error that had unfairly bumped her out of AP Calculus, absolutely refusing to hang up the receiver until it was permanently fixed. She got the class back. She always got the class back. That fierce, unstoppable girl was the daughter I kept desperately looking for at Greg's dinner table, and kept constantly not finding. And for a very long time, I cowardly told myself she was just tired, just busy, just overwhelmed being a new mother, because that convenient explanation cost me absolutely nothing, and the terrifying truth would have cost me everything. I stayed completely quiet through all of it. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in a legal marriage. I told myself she would come to me when she was finally ready, that a good, supportive mother waits in the wings, that pushing too hard would only give Greg another convenient excuse to close yet another door and isolate her further. I have replayed that exact logic in my head more times than I ever want to admit, and I still don't know if it was maternal wisdom or sheer cowardice. Maybe it was a toxic mixture of both. I want to be brutally honest about one more thing, because this story absolutely does not work if I try to paint myself as a blameless saint. I noticed everything. I want to be very clear about that. I noticed the plate photograph. I noticed the declined pharmacy card. I noticed Jessica's visit stop, the mother's group evaporate, and Dr. Aris's name completely disappear from Claire's wall calendar. I noticed all of it happening in real time, exactly the way you notice a terrifying hairline crack in a concrete foundation and desperately tell yourself the house has stood for 80 years, so it will surely stand a while longer. I made 100 tiny, cowardly decisions to say nothing, and I made every single one of them convinced I was being a good mother by staying out of the blast radius. It took me a very long time afterward to finally understand that I had tragically confused respecting my daughter's independence with abandoning her to a predator. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my daughter had already completely stopped waiting to be rescued. She had quietly started building her own way out of the prison months before that explosive Sunday dinner, and she had done it without whispering a single word to me. Update 1. The escalation, when it finally arrived, didn't come all at once like a sudden explosion. It came in calculated stages, each one significantly worse than the last, and each one absorbed by my daughter with the exact same quiet, reasonable calm, because that was literally the only survival tool Greg had left her. The first stage that actually cracked the illusion wide open was the budgeting app. 14 months ago, Greg installed an invasive shared financial tracking app called SyncWealth on Claire's smartphone. "Just so we're always on the exact same page," he claimed, kissing her forehead. Every single purchase she made pinged his phone in real time with a loud notification. A $4 latte at the gas station, a birthday card for her cousin, a pack of gum. He would text her within 3 minutes of the swipe. "What is this $4.50 charge at Sunoco? Did you really need 2 things of stamps? We're on a budget, Claire." Claire started obsessively keeping crumpled paper receipts in her coat pockets. Not for herself, but in case she needed to verbally defend a minor purchase later that evening, the way you would keep a receipt for a strict store return. She told herself it was just efficient household management. "It's actually kind of nice." She lied to me once, not quite meeting my eyes while we folded laundry. "I know exactly where every single dollar goes now." I casually asked her that same afternoon whether the app showed his personal purchases too, the way it meticulously tracked hers. She looked at me strangely, like the concept hadn't even occurred to her. "I mean, it's supposed to," she said slowly, her brow furrowing. "I guess I've never actually checked his side." A week later, she mentioned, almost entirely in passing, that his half of the app kept showing the word pending on literally anything over $100. "It's just a bank API technical glitch," he had told her smoothly, assuring her the bank's IT department was looking into it. She believed him. I believed him too, honestly, at the time. It is a terrifying thing in hindsight how completely reasonable every single lie sounded when presented on its own. She tracked every penny, he hid thousands. The second stage was Sophie's ear tubes. A year and a half ago, Sophie needed a minor surgical procedure to put tubes in her ears for chronic infections. It was a completely routine, 20-minute outpatient surgery, the exact kind Crestwood General does 15 times a week. But Greg intentionally turned it into a massive, panic-inducing crisis. He called Arthur and me the night before the procedure, his voice tight and breathless with a manufactured urgency that absolutely did not match the actual medical risk. "I need everyone to stay calm," he commanded over the phone, as if any of us were the ones currently panicking. "I need everyone highly organized. This family doesn't have its finances in order for something catastrophic like this, and that's a huge problem." What he actually meant, it turned out, was my Aunt Beatrice's trust fund. Years earlier, my Aunt Beatrice had set aside a modest education fund for her great-grandchildren, to be securely held until each child turned 18. The total amount sitting in the high-yield account was roughly $80,000. I was named the primary trustee after a very mild heart attack scare of my own 2 years ago. It was nothing serious, just 3 days in the cardiac ward and a stern lecture about sodium from my former ER colleagues, but I had immediately added Claire as a co-trustee ward just as a logical precaution so someone younger could legally step in if I ever couldn't. The night before Sophie's minor ear surgery, Greg sat aggressively at my kitchen table and made his calculated case. Medical bills, follow-up specialist care, what if something goes horribly wrong under the anesthesia and there's a real financial emergency? God forbid, he said, shaking his head. And I vividly remember how perfectly he delivered that God forbid. Like an actor reciting a line he had practiced in the mirror for an hour. Somebody responsible needs immediate signing authority who isn't 61 and recovering from a heart condition. Martha, no offense. I said I would think about it. Claire, sitting right beside him with dark, exhausted circles under her eyes from a sleepless night worrying about her baby's surgery, reached under the table and squeezed my hand tightly. "It would just be for absolute emergencies, Mom," she pleaded softly, "just in case." I didn't sleep well that entire night, though not for the medical reason Greg assumed. Something about the entire conversation sat deeply wrong with me, like a sour taste in the back of my throat, though I couldn't have articulated what it was exactly. I remember standing alone in my dark kitchen at midnight, staring at the closed laptop on the granite counter, thinking about my Aunt Beatrice who had set that money aside 40 years earlier for a great-grandchild she never lived to meet, and feeling a heavy dread that I was about to do something irreversible. I did it anyway. That is the part I have to sit with most nights. Not that I was foolishly tricked, but that I felt the hesitation clearly, named it in my own mind, and intentionally overrode it because a terrified young mother in a surgical waiting room begged me to. Refusing her felt, in that high-stress moment, like the crueler choice. I legally added Greg as an authorized signer on the trust's primary checking account 2 days later, right in the hospital cafeteria on a laptop while a bank representative walked me through the electronic signatures over the phone. Sophie came through the 20-minute ear tube surgery perfectly. There was absolutely no emergency. I didn't think about that trust account again for the better part of 18 months. A few weeks after the surgery, Greg mentioned super casually over a plate of pasta that he had set up paperless electronic statements for the trust account to keep the mail clutter down, and that any physical correspondence from the bank should just go to a P.O. box he had recently rented downtown instead of their home address. Just so nothing important gets lost in the shuffle with all of Sophie's school flyers coming in, he smiled. I remember thinking at the time that it was surprisingly thoughtful of him to handle the boring administrative logistics. I didn't ask why a secure trust fund meant for my granddaughter needed its mail aggressively rerouted away from her own mother's kitchen counter. I desperately wish I had. The stage that finally cracked something open in Claire happened 6 weeks before that explosive Sunday dinner. Claire had to call Crestwood Community Credit Union to get a formally printed statement for the trust account. It was a strict requirement for Sophie's application to an advanced private elementary school program that demanded proof of an existing education fund. The woman who answered the phone at the branch was an old, trusted co-worker of hers, Brenda Lewis, someone Claire had personally trained on the complex loan software herself years earlier. "Let me just pull that right up for you, sweetie," Brenda said cheerfully. And then there was a long, heavy pause on the line that Claire would later describe to me as the most terrifying silence of her entire adult life. "Claire, this account has had a massive amount of activity. Did you know that?" Claire told her she must be looking at the wrong account number. Brenda read the available balance out loud. It was less than $30,000. "That literally cannot be right," Claire said, standing completely frozen in her own kitchen, Sophie's crayon drawing spread across the counter in front of her. "Can you email me a full, unredacted transaction history? Everything, going back as far as the system goes." "I can pull it," Brenda said, her voice dropping to a careful whisper. "But Claire, I want to say something first, strictly one friend to another, not the bank talking. Whatever the hell this is, I strongly advise you not to mention to anyone that you're asking for these records." "Not yet." Claire didn't ask her why. She said later she instantly, sickeningly knew. That was the exact night I saw her in my driveway, frantically sliding a thick manila folder into her leather tote bag, ending a phone call so fast she physically jumped when I knocked on the driver's side window. I almost didn't knock at all. I had come out in the cold to bring her a Tupperware container of leftover beef stew she had forgotten on the counter, and I saw her sitting in her car in my own driveway with the engine completely off and the dome light glaring. Something about the rigid stillness of her, the terrified way she sat with both hands wrapped in a death grip around her phone like it might be violently taken from her, made me stop dead on the porch steps for a full minute before I forced myself to walk over. 35 years of emergency nursing teaches you how to read a room incredibly fast. It also teaches you that sometimes the absolute kindest thing you can do is knock anyway, gently, and let the bleeding person inside decide exactly how much of the terrible truth to hand you through the window. "Trust me," she whispered through the cracked glass, her chin trembling but her eyes terrified and crystal clear at the exact same time. "Please, Mom, do not say a single word to Greg, not yet." I told her I wouldn't. I meant it, and I absolutely hated meaning it, because every single protective instinct I had left over from catching medical disasters before they became fatalities was screaming at me to rip the car door open and demand answers right there on the concrete. I didn't. I have thought many times since about how incredibly strange it is to finally learn the right moment to stay quiet, 7 years after all the moments I should have screamed. From that night forward, her leather tote bag never left her body. Not at the grocery store, not at church, not at school pickup, and not once in 6 weeks at my own dinner table. Brenda called her back 2 days later, completely off the clock, from her personal cell phone on a Thursday evening while Claire was standing in her own driveway pretending to check the mailbox so Greg wouldn't wonder why she had stepped outside. What Brenda had found wasn't something she felt legally safe saying on a recorded bank line or inside a building with security cameras in the ceiling. She had pulled 18 months of hard statements. What she found wasn't one bad financial decision. It was a calculated, methodical, and chillingly quiet pattern. The exact kind of predatory pattern Claire herself had been professionally trained to spot in other people's accounts for years before she was ever asked to spot it in her own. $55,000 had been systematically moved out of the Beatrice Whitfield Educational Trust in 12 separate electronic withdrawals over 18 months. Each withdrawal was meticulously timed and sized just under the $5,000 threshold that would have triggered extra internal bank scrutiny. Each withdrawal was routed first into a dormant joint checking account Claire barely ever used, then instantly bounced out again within 48 hours to a secondary account Claire had absolutely never seen before. That hidden account was opened 9 months after Greg got signing authority, registered under the name GR Enterprises LLC. It was a business that, according to the Pennsylvania Secretary of State's business registry Brenda had also secretly pulled, had 0 employees, 0 actual clients, and 0 filed tax returns. The most sickening part was the memo lines. The withdrawals had explicitly typed labels: Sophie Enrichment, Sophie Medical, Sophie Extracurricular Activities. 14 months of a fraudulent paper trail built entirely out of my innocent granddaughter's name, G.R. Enterprises LLC, Brenda's records proved, had been officially formed the exact same week Claire remembered signing a massive stack of tax paperwork during Sophie's chaotic bath time, with Greg thrusting an uncapped pen at her and giving her no time to read past his brightly highlighted signature lines. Claire sat alone in her car with that horrifying fact for a long time before she said anything to me about it. She had blindly signed her own daughter's college fund into a predator's hands with a wet, squirming 5-year-old on her hip, and she had not even known what legal document was sitting in front of her. The paperless electronic statements made sudden, sickening sense, too. So did the downtown P.O. box, the one Greg had rented to keep the mail clutter down. Every single notice the credit union had ever sent about that trust account, every unusual activity text alert, every large transaction confirmation letter, had been landing quietly in a locked metal box on 4th Street that only Greg had the brass key to for over a year, while the rest of us blindly assumed the silence meant the money was safe. Claire spent 3 consecutive nights after that phone call not sleeping at all, sitting on the bathroom floor with the shower running to muffle the sound, aggressively going back through 7 years of bank alerts on her phone, perfectly matching dates and lies. A luxury jet ski rental at Lake Wallenpaupack in April of last year, the exact same week Greg told the family he was working a grueling real estate conference in Scranton. A massive initiation fee at the Crestwood Valley Country Club paid in full the exact same month he aggressively told Claire they desperately needed to cut back on their weekly grocery budget because of inflation. A huge cash advance the first week of December, the exact same week he had coldly told her Santa's budget is super tight this year, Claire, we all have to sacrifice a little. And underneath all of it, older and more twisted than any of it, one single line Claire found in the trust's very first printed statement after Greg was added as a signer, a fast electronic transfer of $450, dated the exact same week as Sophie's ear tube surgery, labeled times medical copay. Sophie's actual surgery, Claire furiously confirmed with the hospital billing office the next morning, had cost the family absolutely nothing out of pocket. Their premium insurance had covered it in full. He hadn't waited for a medical emergency to use the access he had been given for one. He had started aggressively spending the money the literal moment his name hit the signature card, while my tiny granddaughter was still waking up from anesthesia in a recovery room down the hall from where I had worked for 35 years. Claire didn't come to me right away with the proof. Not because she didn't trust me, but because, she told me later with tears in her eyes, she needed to know she wasn't legally wrong before she said a single word out loud that could never be unsaid. She secretly met with a ruthless elder law and trust attorney in Pittsburgh, a woman named Helen Vance, no relation to Greg, an odd, funny coincidence Claire mentioned like it meant something, and maybe it did. She brought Brenda's highlighted printouts. She brought 6 years of matched bank alerts. She brought the GR Enterprises LLC registry documents. She even brought her wedding photo album, for some reason she couldn't quite explain, as if she desperately needed a witness in the room who had known Greg before all of it. Someone who could look at the cold legal paperwork and the smiling photographs side by side and confirm that she hadn't completely lost her mind. Helen read through all 15 pages of it in a single sitting, in a small, sterile conference room with a ticking wall clock, and told her flatly that this wasn't a marital financial dispute anymore. This is a severe breach of fiduciary duty against a minor beneficiary, Helen said, taking off her glasses. And depending on how the district attorney's office wants to legally characterize this paper trail, it could be a great deal more than just civil fraud. It's grand larceny. You did the hardest part already, Helen told her, sliding the papers back across the table. You found the bleeding. Now, we just have to decide exactly how you want to hand the diagnosis to him. In front of everyone, Claire said instantly, without having to think about it for a single second. He never did any of this abuse quietly. I'm not going to let him stop being watched now. They drafted a formal, terrifying legal notice. Helen offered to send it quietly by certified mail to his office. No, Claire told her, her voice turning to absolute steel. I am going to hand it to him myself. She scheduled the execution in her mind for the following Sunday. Our Sunday dinner. The one Greg absolutely never missed, because Greg loved an audience for everything, including, as it spectacularly turned out, his own absolute undoing. Update 2. Which brings us right back to that Sunday, to the dining room table, to the warm apple crisp, to Greg's hand still shining faintly with cinnamon syrup as he waited eagerly for a table full of people to laugh at his cruel joke about my daughter's weight. I set my fork down slowly. I looked him dead in the eye, channeling every terrifying attending physician I had ever worked under. Greg, I said, my voice perfectly level. Do you truly want Sophie to grow up and marry a man who publicly decides what she's allowed to eat? His smug smirk flickered just for a fraction of a second, the exact way a picture flickers on a dying television set. The practiced, oily charm underneath it was working overtime to rapidly reassemble itself. That's not the same thing at all, Martha, I'm just keeping her healthy. Why not? Arthur said. 2 words. 2 words was a massive amount for my husband to spend. It landed at that mahogany table like a physical gunshot. Even 6-year-old Sophie went completely still, sensing the atmospheric pressure drop in the room. Greg's mouth opened slightly. Absolutely nothing came out. For the very first time in 7 years at my table, he had no clever joke ready, no defensive line rehearsed in the car, nothing to grasp onto. That is exactly when Claire stood up. The panicked tears I had been braced to see for 7 years were completely gone from her face entirely. She looked calmer, colder, and more powerful than I had seen her look in a decade. Calmer than she had looked walking down the aisle at her own wedding. She reached into her leather tote bag, the bag that had not left her body in 6 grueling weeks, and pulled out a thick, legal-sized white envelope. She slapped it down hard onto the table right beside his water glass, the exact way you would violently deal a winning hand of cards you had been holding onto for a very long time. I was originally going to wait until after we finished dessert, she said quietly, her voice echoing in the silent room. But open it now. Greg let out a short, nervous laugh, completely alone in the pathetic sound of it. What the hell is this, Claire? Some kind of dramatic joke? Are these divorce papers? Because we can talk about this at home without an audience. He tore the flap open anyway, still smiling his empty smile, still absolutely certain he had nothing to genuinely fear from a broken woman he had spent 7 years convincing couldn't even manage a grocery budget. I watched his face intently, while he read the bolded first line. The confident smile went first. Then the color went, all of it, draining right out of his cheeks until he looked physically ill. Across the top of the first page, in heavy black legal letters, were the words, Notice of breach of fiduciary duty and demand for full accounting. Stapled aggressively behind it, 15 pages long, was Brenda's unredacted transaction summary. Every single illegal transfer dated, every routing number meticulously traced. Every fake memo label times Sophie enrichment, Sophie medical, Sophie activities times laid out in a neat, damning column right beside the undeniable truth of where the money had actually gone. The country club membership. The Lake Wallenpaupack jet ski. The massive cash advances timed perfectly to Christmases and birthdays. $55,000 systematically moved out of a dead woman's loving gift to her great-granddaughter. One careful, greedy withdrawal at a time. Greg's hands actually started shaking audibly, the paper rattling against the table around page 3. Where did you get this? He whispered, his voice violently cracking on the very last word. All the theatrical performance was completely gone out of him now. There was absolutely nothing left underneath the suit but a terrified, pathetic man sitting at a dinner table full of people who had just watched him instantly become a monster. Claire just smiled. It was the exact same calm, terrifying smile she had been practicing entirely alone in her car for 6 weeks. I used to be exceptionally good at my job, Greg. You were the one who forced me to quit it. Did you really think I forgot how to read a ledger? This is a massive misunderstanding, he said, his voice getting louder, shrill, desperately looking around the table for the loyal audience he always needed, the one that had politely laughed at him 100 times before. Martha, Arthur, you know exactly how this looks on paper, but it's not what it looks like. I was investing it, I was going to pay it all back. It was just a rough patch with the brokerage. For 18 straight months? Claire asked, her voice like ice. Using our daughter's ear surgery as the fake reason you needed the signing authority in the first place? His mother-in-law voice, the wheedling, reasonable tone he always used on me, the overly flattering tone he used on Arthur, the condescendingly teasing tone he used on Claire, all of it collapsed at once like a demolished building. Underneath it was something none of us had ever seen at that table before. A man with absolutely nothing left to spin. You do not ever get to decide what I eat, Claire said, and her voice didn't shake a single millimeter. You do not ever get to decide what I spend, and you absolutely do not get to decide who our daughter becomes. Not anymore. We are done. Greg turned frantically to me, the way he always used to when he needed manipulative reinforcements. Martha, Arthur, come on. You've known me for 7 years. Surely you're not going to just sit there and let her criminally ambush me like this over a temporary cash flow issue. Arthur set down his own silver fork very slowly. He looked Greg dead in the eye, and for the second time that evening, spent words he didn't have to spend. We watched you take her plate. That was the absolute end of it, really. Not the thick legal envelope, not the 15 pages of bank fraud, not even the massive $55,000 number at the bottom of Brenda's summary. It was Arthur's 7 flat words, delivered without a single ounce of heat, that seemed to finally land on Greg the way nothing else had. The crushing understanding that the people he had spent 7 years constantly performing for had simply, quietly, and permanently stopped believing the performance. Sophie, 6 years old, looked between her furious parents with the particular, heartbreaking quiet of a smart child who inherently understands that something enormous and irreversible has just happened, even if she can't fully name it yet. Daddy, she said softly, clutching her coloring book. Are you in trouble with the police? Nobody at that table lied to her. Nobody had the strength or the desire left to. Greg stood up so fast his heavy dining chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor, the legal pages still clutched in a death grip in his fist. For a terrifying second, I thought he might physically tear them, or throw his water glass, or do something violent that would have made the rest of the evening even harder than it needed to be. He didn't. He just stood there, breathing heavily, looking at all of us looking blankly back at him. I watched him mentally calculate and understand, in real time, that there was absolutely no version of this room he could ever talk his way back into. This isn't over, he spat, which is exactly the pathetic thing men like Greg say when, in every single way that actually matters, it already is. He stormed out the front door, slamming it so hard the porch light flickered. The days that immediately followed moved faster than any of us expected, the exact way a cracked dam doesn't just leak so much as it simply, violently gives way all at once. Greg's mother, Patricia, called Claire the very next morning before 8 a.m. I was there when the call came in, sitting at Claire's kitchen counter helping her sort through Sophie's school forms, and I watched my daughter physically brace for another screaming fight before she even tapped answer. She didn't get one. I need you to know something terrible, Patricia said, her voice thin and weeping over the speakerphone. This isn't the first time he's done this. There was a woman before you, back in his 20s, an ex-fiancée named Melissa. He secretly took $14,000 from their joint wedding savings for a startup business opportunity that never actually existed. When Melissa found out and rightfully confronted him, he told our entire family she was bipolar and having a manic episode. We believed him. I have spent 10 years wondering if we should have believed her instead. Patricia was quiet for a long, heavy moment. I am so deeply sorry, Claire. I should have said something before your wedding. I cowardly told myself it wasn't my place. I heard my exact own excuse come out of another older woman's mouth and felt something deep in my chest go freezing cold. Patricia became, in the grueling legal weeks that followed, the absolute ally none of us expected. She voluntarily sat with Claire through 3 grueling meetings with Helen. She gave a signed, notarized affidavit about the financial pattern with Melissa, which Helen said mattered more than any of us realized, because a family court judge doesn't just want to see what a man did once. It wants to see exactly what he does, given the opportunity, every single time. Patricia also, quietly and without ever being asked, wired $10,000 to Claire the following week with a note that just said, "For a ruthless lawyer, for Sophie, for whatever you need it for. Do not argue." Claire cried harder over that wire transfer, she told me later, than she had over almost anything else that entire month. Not because of the massive amount, but because it was the very first time in 7 years someone from Greg's side of the family had simply given her something without a manipulative condition attached to it. Greg himself did not go quietly. He called Claire 22 times in the first 3 days, wildly alternating between screaming fury and a wet, performative, sobbing grief that fooled absolutely no one who had been paying attention. He aggressively accused her of destroying their beautiful family over a banking technicality. He threatened that if she pursued anything legal, he would fight for full custody and paint her to the judge as an unstable, controlling mother who had maliciously cut him off from his own daughter over a misunderstanding. Helen had explicitly warned Claire he might try exactly that. She had a massive binder ready for it. 7 years of aggressive text messages, the invasive SyncWealth app history proving his financial control, 3 sworn witnesses at that Sunday dinner table, and Brenda's unredacted bank records, which absolutely didn't care how Greg wanted to spin the narrative, because cold numbers, unlike people, do not perform for an audience. He also, according to the credit union's fraud department, tried something incredibly stupid that week. 2 days after the dinner, he physically walked into the branch and attempted to wire the remaining balance out of the GR Enterprises account, the last $10,000 he hadn't yet blown into a personal offshore account under his name alone. Helen had already filed a massive emergency petition with the probate court to freeze the trust and any linked accounts pending a full criminal investigation. The transfer instantly bounced. When Brenda, flanked by a security guard named Marcus, came out to the lobby to inform him the accounts were legally frozen by court order, Greg reportedly lost his mind, screaming that it was a misunderstanding with his mother-in-law. Brenda told me later it was the calmest and most satisfied she had ever felt telling a customer to leave the premises. Greg lost his lucrative job at the luxury real estate brokerage 11 days after that dinner. Officially, the HR reason given was departmental restructuring. Unofficially, according to a friend of Arthur's who still worked in commercial zoning, the managing broker had gotten wind of an LLC registered under Greg's name that had never been disclosed as outside business activity, a massive violation of his strict employment contract. The brokerage had quietly decided they didn't want their prestigious name anywhere near whatever financial explosion was about to unfold in family and probate court. Helen also filed a comprehensive report with the county prosecutor's office, flagging the massive theft for possible felony charges under Pennsylvania's financial exploitation statute. The assistant district attorney who reviewed it called Claire directly. He explained that proving criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt in a case this deeply entangled with an ongoing marriage would be a nightmare, and the civil remedies already in aggressive motion through the probate court would likely recover more of the actual money much faster than a drawn-out criminal trial ever would. That doesn't mean what he did wasn't severe exploitation, the ADA told her gently. It just means the system's best weapon for this particular fight happens to live in a different courthouse. Claire said it was the first time someone in an official capacity had used the word exploitation about her own marriage without her having to supply the word. First, the divorce filing hit Greg's desk 17 days after that Sunday dinner. Custody was hotly contested for exactly one mediation session before Greg's own terrified attorney, reviewing the massive evidence binder Helen had assembled, violently advised him to accept a standard shared custody arrangement rather than risk a furious judge reading the full trust file into the permanent public record. He got Sophie every other weekend and Wednesday dinners. He showed up to the very first Wednesday dinner 40 minutes late, smelling like cheap cologne, and didn't show up at all to the third. By the following spring, the Wednesday dinners had quietly become a formality neither side bothered enforcing, and the every other weekend schedule had naturally drifted into roughly one weekend a month, depending on what else Greg had going on. Helen told Claire not to push it. Judges notice who continuously shows up and who constantly doesn't, she said. Let his own record build itself. The trust itself took the better part of 6 months to untangle. An independent forensic fiduciary was appointed to audit the accounts fully at Greg's personal expense, per the court's strict order. The probate judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Harrison, was completely unmoved by Greg's attorney's weak argument that the withdrawals represented commingled marital funds, rather than grand theft from a minor beneficiary. She literally read the memo labels out loud in open court: Sophie enrichment, Sophie medical, Sophie activities. She looked over her glasses and asked Greg's attorney directly, "Counselor, would your client care to explain to this court exactly which of a 5-year-old girl's extracurricular activities required a $6,000 jet ski?" Restitution was brutally structured as a permanent lien against his future wages and any assets recovered from the forced sale of the jet ski he had been keeping at Lake Wallenpaupack. It sold at public auction 8 months later for significantly less than he owed on it. Through all of it, there was one specific night I remember vividly. A Tuesday, bitterly cold for October, when I found Claire sitting on the floor of Sophie's closet with the heavy wedding album open in her lap. She wasn't crying, exactly. She was just staring intently at a photograph of Greg laughing at their reception, his arm tight around her waist, both of them looking so incredibly young it almost didn't look like either of them anymore. "I don't miss him," she said fiercely when she felt me standing in the doorway. "I want to be really clear about that, Mom. I don't miss him at all." She traced the edge of the glossy photograph with one finger. "I think I just miss believing I understood my own life. I miss the version of this story where I wasn't completely wrong about someone's soul for 7 years." I sat down on the closet floor right beside her, on carpet that desperately needed vacuuming, in a house that was about to be sold, and I didn't tell her it would be fine. I have delivered enough devastating news in 35 years to know that empty platitudes are for people who aren't ready to actually grieve yet. I just sat with her in the quiet. Some things you absolutely cannot fix. You can only stay in the room while someone else survives them. "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone?" she whispered after a long while. Some nights I miss the version of him from the wedding, not the real him, the one I thought I married. I know that's not the same person. I know it maybe was never a real person at all, but I still catch myself missing him for about 4 seconds before I remember the truth. She closed the heavy album gently, the way you would close a door on a room you were never going to walk through again. "Is that stupid?" "No," I told her, putting my arm around her shoulder. "That's just grief. It doesn't check first to see if the thing you lost was ever actually real. It just misses the shape of it." She nodded, and put the album in a cardboard box marked for deep storage rather than the trash, which told me something profound too. That she wasn't trying to magically erase 7 years of her life, she was just finally ready to stop living inside them. Sophie saw a wonderful child therapist for a while that winter, a woman who had a room full of beanbag chairs and hand puppets. Sophie drew a lot of pictures of the old house with the roof colored in pitch black, which the therapist said wasn't unusual, and a few pictures of the new house with a massive yellow sun that took up almost the entire page, which she said wasn't unusual either. Just further along the path. By spring, Sophie had mostly stopped asking why Daddy didn't live with them anymore and started asking instead whether she could invite a new friend over for a sleepover, which Claire told me felt like crossing the actual finish line more than any court date ever had. It has been 14 months since that explosive Sunday dinner. Claire is back at Crestwood Community Credit Union now, not as a senior data analyst this time, but as the assistant branch manager. It is a job Brenda all but aggressively created a spot for the literal moment the position opened up. Claire bought a beautiful, small house 8 minutes from mine, close enough that Sophie can ride her bike over on sunny weekends, but far enough that it is unmistakably Claire's own kingdom. Greg lives 3 towns over now, in a cramped apartment, still paying down what the furious judge ordered, still, according to Patricia, telling absolutely anyone who will listen at bars that the whole thing was blown way out of proportion by his crazy ex-wife. I genuinely believe he believes that. I have met enough broken people in my life to know that the ones who do the absolute most damage are rarely the ones twirling a cartoon mustache. They are the ones who never once, not for a single day, thought of themselves as the villain of their own story. He sees Sophie on his court-ordered weekends, mostly, though Patricia tells me he has cancelled more of them than he has kept since the jet ski was auctioned off. Sophie is old enough now to notice the flaky pattern without anyone pointing it out to her. She told her mother once, matter-of-factly, the way 6-year-olds say the absolute truest things, "I don't think Daddy likes being told no." Claire didn't correct her. Arthur still says almost nothing at Sunday dinner, but he explicitly pulls Sophie's chair out for her now before anyone else sits down, every single week, without ever being asked. I have come to understand that tiny gesture is its own kind of quiet eulogy for the 7 years none of us can ever get back. A quiet man doing, over and over, the small protective things nobody did for his daughter when it truly mattered. I think about that Sunday dinner often, not the humiliation of the dessert plate, but the 6 agonizing weeks before it. The 6 weeks Claire spent secretly building her way out in total, terrifying silence, telling no one, not even her own mother, until she had every single financial fact lined up like a brick wall she was finally strong enough to stand safely behind. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole ugly story, whether I regret staying quiet for as long as I cowardly did. The honest answer is more complicated than just regret. I regret the lost years. I don't regret the restraint, not entirely, because I have also come to truly believe that the version of this story where I marched into her marriage uninvited and screamed about what I saw would not have ended with a devastating envelope on that mahogany table. It would have ended with a massive, permanent wall between my daughter and me, one Greg would have been only too happy to build brick by brick, using my own maternal interference as the mortar. I used to think being a good mother meant aggressively jumping in to fix my daughter's pain. I know now that waiting has its own terrible cost, that quiet can look exactly like peace from the outside while a soul is actively being taken apart on the inside. One small cruelty, one declined pharmacy card, one forced, forgiving laugh at a time. I don't know that I will ever fully forgive myself for the years I spent telling myself it wasn't my place, but I have learned, watching my brilliant daughter build her own way out of a prison I couldn't break her out of, that sometimes the most useful thing a mother can do isn't intervene early. It's just to be trustworthy enough and patient enough that when her daughter is finally ready to run, there is still a safe hand there to catch her. There is a particular, poetic kind of justice in the fact that the person who finally stopped him wasn't a ruthless lawyer, or a furious judge, or even me, but Claire herself, using the exact forensic accounting skills he had manipulated her into abandoning 7 years earlier. The thing he aggressively took from her, her career, her confidence, her sharp instincts turned out to be the exact weapon she needed to end him. He spent 7 years convincing her she wasn't mathematically capable of managing a grocery budget. She spent 6 weeks proving, with his own sloppy paper trail, exactly how capable she still was. He humiliated her at my table in front of her own child, absolutely certain that a quiet, retired nurse across the tablecloth was no threat to anyone. He was right about the quiet. He was wrong about everything else. He mistook my daughter's traumatized silence for permanent surrender for 7 long years, right up until the exact millisecond she set a legal envelope down beside his water glass and proved calmly, in front of everyone he had ever performed for, that she had been listening, and counting, and waiting the entire time. Claire is standing straighter now than I have seen her stand in a decade. She eats her dinner without ever watching anyone else's face first for permission. My granddaughter asks for a second helping of dessert without nervously checking to see if it's allowed, and nobody at that table ever takes her plate away. That, in the absolute end, is the part of the story I actually wanted to tell you. Not the dramatic reveal, not the envelope, not the court case. The dinner after. The first one, weeks later, where Sophie asked for more apple crisp and got it, and nobody at the table so much as blinked. I still make the pork loin every third Sunday. I still bake the apple crisp, the exact same recipe my own mother used. Arthur still sits at the head of the table saying almost nothing, noticing absolutely everything. Some Sundays, while setting the table, I catch myself glancing at the empty spot where Greg used to sit, not with any longing, but the exact way you would glance at a surgical scar. A mark that tells you something terrible happened here. Something you survived. Something that changed the permanent shape of the room, even after the wound itself fully closed. He humiliated my daughter at that table once, certain the quiet woman across from him posed absolutely no threat at all. I let him believe that for exactly as long as it took to be useful, I would do it again. I would do almost everything about those 7 years differently if I could, except that one Sunday when my daughter, who had never really stopped being strong at all, set an envelope down beside his plate and ended it herself. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out and allows us to bring you even more awesome stories. Thank you so much for watching.